everyone. Welcome to those folks joining us for this webinar discussing the General Assembly session that just wrapped on Monday. I'm John O'Connor. I edit the Banner's political coverage. The digital team tells me that more people signed up for this discussion than any we have held before. So thank you so much for your interest and thank you for subscribing. The Baltimore Banner is a nonprofit newsroom and our journalism is powered by contributions from our community of readers and subscribers. I've got a list of questions prepared, but we really want to hear from you. You'll see a Q&A button down there at the bottom of the window. If you want to submit a question, press that and type it in. We can see those questions, but they don't show up for everybody else in the webinar. So let's meet the team. Joining me, we've got Pamela Wood, who covers politics and leads our work led our work on the state budget this year. We've also got Brenda Wintrode, who covers state politics. And finally, Madeleine O'Neill, who is our jack of all trades. She handled the legislature, federal lawsuits, and the all-important fight to name a state cocktail. So I'm going to start off the top here with kind of the biggest issue that dominated the session, which was the eventually $3.3 billion budget shortfall that the state had to close this year. Pamela, can you give us the big picture view here? How did we get to a $3.3 billion budget shortfall? How did Governor Moore and lawmakers solve it? And with what they did this year, how does that set the state up for budget shortfalls projected for future years?
Well, thank you so much, John, for that question. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. I appreciate people wanting to hear about the state budget because it is not glamorous, but it's very important. Look, the one sentence summary is there was not enough money coming in to pay for all the planned spending, right? That's the imbalance in the equation. And any look, Maryland was seeing the COVID era, money coming from the federal government starting to dry up. At the same time, the economy has been kind of sluggish, and that means, income tax coming into the state, sales tax coming into the state, not keeping pace with the increased spending in government programs. So it was in the fall, like $2.7 billion gap predicted. Then in December, it went up to $3 billion and then $3.3 billion as we started to see the effects of the Trump administration and more people losing their jobs. So that was a big gap that they had to fill. And that took up all the oxygen in the room for 90 days.
And this one's for the team here, but because you guys all heard about this throughout the session, but what did lawmakers tell you about how the budget affected everything else happening during the session?
Well, I think one thing is that, it made it difficult to get anything done that had what they call a fiscal note on it. If you had a proposal and it was going to cost, $10 million a year to do something and you're a lawmaker, that meant your bill was probably not going to pass, right? So much effort had to be focused on closing that budget gap that it didn't leave a lot of room for other things to happen in the session.
Yeah, I heard one legislative staffer joke early on in the session that if your fiscal note is greater than $5, your bill is dead. And that's kind of how it worked out. Anything that cost money was not going to do very well this session.
And then
go ahead, Brenda.
Yeah, and then we can't forget the complication of the federal government and how much that pushed off them even moving the budget at first. They waited until the federal government passed the continuing resolution before they did anything.
Yeah, it was this really dark cloud, honestly, over the session. And there was a big waiting game, like Brenda said, of like how what is the Republican-led Congress going to do? Like, are they going to slash spending that affects the state government's budget? Are all these jobs being lost? The leaders of the budget committees tried to wait as long as they could to get as much information as they could. And it ended up resulting in the final things weren't signed off, the final votes, until sine die on Monday, day 90 out of 90.
Yeah, there's like a 2 or 3 week period there in the middle of the session, right, where basically everything was kind of on hold because the budget was just waiting on DC.
Yeah,
that's like never a good place to be.
Right? It seems like last year, but it was only a couple of weeks ago where we were wondering if there's going to be a federal government shutdown. That was part of this too.
That was like 4 governments ago, right? It just seems so long ago. So one of the ways that they closed this shortfall was 1.6 billion in new or additional taxes and fees. So how did Governor Moore and lawmakers choose the revenue sources they did? What ideas were off the table completely? And where are state residents going to notice those taxes?
Yeah, let's start with the last question, which is how are they raising that money? $1.6 billion. It's just like an astonishingly large amount of money. Look, if you are a high earner in the state, you're going to pay more in your income taxes. This is above $500,000 or so, more in your personal income tax. If you make more than $350,000, you're going to pay more on your capital gains. And if you make more than $200,000, you're going to see diminishing benefits from itemizing deductions on your tax return. So, the student loan payments, the mortgage interest, all those things people deduct, it's going to phase out. The value of that phases out if you make more than $200,000. There's also a $5 tire fee that goes into the transportation fund. There's the sales taxes going on vending machine. When you buy your chips, you're going to have to pay the 6% sales tax. There is a vehicle excise tax. It's been 6%. Now it's going up to 6.5%. Really across, oh, and I forgot the biggest one, the tech tax, which is a 3% tax on IT and data services that would be applied to both businesses and individuals. So like my WordPress website, I don't know, maybe next year I'll have to pay a 3% tax on that. That had a lot of consternation. So that's what they arrived at the end, but there was a lot of wrangling to get there. Governor Moore in particular, one of his key goals was not to have a broad-based tax that would hit everybody. So no sales tax. The state has a little portion on the property tax, no increase to that, no broad-based income tax increase. He really wanted to avoid that, and he got that in the end. Other things he didn't get.
We're going to go to a reader question here from Carol, who asks, what were the main causes of the budget deficit? What impacts did the cutbacks have on spending for infrastructure and earth-friendly changes to energy production and farming?
Well, that's a lot. I mean, the causes of the deficit were, again, revenues not increasing at the same rate as expenses. There's also a complicating factor of it's been difficult to estimate the health department's budget, and that contributed to it. And there are in this budget about $2 billion in budget cuts, both in general fund and in special funds. And it's really sort of spread across the board. They spread the pain. I mean, the list is like, 10 million here, 5 million there, cutting back. They're also abolishing more than 300 state government positions, which are mostly not filled. There's no layoffs. It's really across the board. I can't say in particular. I don't actually know how, climate programs are actually affected by this, but there's really kind of a haircut across state government.
Yeah, well, there's some energy questions that are coming later that touch on energy production in particular, so we can get to that part of it when we get there. And Pamela, last 2 years, the House and the Senate have had kind of some significant differences in their budgets that they've had to resolve. We've had these kind of short-lived budget standoffs for a while, but that didn't happen this year. Why do you think that is?
I think the difference this year is the problem was just so much bigger. The House and the Senate, look, these are led by Democrats, a Democratic supermajority, but even though they're the same party, they have the same goals, but there's differences in how to get to the end result. The House of Delegates in particular has been more interested in finding ways to raise revenues. The Senate has been more cautious on raising revenues and more into cuts. And so they've been at loggerheads a little bit. Last year, the House proposed $1 billion in, raising money, and they thought that would help short term and long term as well. In the end, they settled with about $300 million with a bunch of little kind of ticky tacky fees that we've all, been paying, car registration, some tobacco taxes. But that was, again, hundreds of millions of dollars is a lot of money, but it pales in comparison to $3 billion plus dollars. So the scale of the problem was so big, they had no choice but to work together much more closely and collaboratively. And it was the House leaders, the Senate leaders, and the governor and his staff in conversation the whole session.
Here's a question from Ralph. I'd like to hear more about budget cuts. How does cutting open positions really save money?
That's a
I'm
good
sorry, hang on. There's a second part. Are any layoffs in the works, and will the cuts be negated by hiring laid off federal employees?
Well, as of right now, short term, they're not talking about layoffs of federal workers. That would be or state government workers. Layoffs not in the cards. There was discussion about whether or not to go through with a planned 1% salary increase across the board, which they ended up getting, right? That's more what they're talking about. They're not talking about right now laying off state workers. And yes, even if positions are open, and nobody's in them getting a paycheck, they budget for that, right? So, like on paper, there is savings, even in abolishing open positions, because now going forward, they don't have to work that money into the budget for if somebody were to be hired. So, I understand where it seems like you're not really saving, but in terms of writing the budget, there is savings there.
All right, so let's move on to the kind of second big item of the session, which was the blueprint for Maryland's future. It's kind of an ambitious multi-year plan to improve K-12 education. Everyone came into the session, from my view at least, everyone came into the session agreeing that the state needed to make changes to the plan. But Pamela, can you outline what the blueprint does and kind of why people thought that changes needed to be made?
The blueprint, as you noted, is this ambitious plan, and it's also an expensive plan with the goal of restoring Maryland's public schools to the best in the nation. And it was born out of years of work from a group called the Kirwan Commission. They looked at research and they looked at evidence-based practices to improve education, and they're now implementing them. It got passed to implement it in 2020. It's been a ramp up of programs from helping teachers do their jobs better, more funding for kids in schools that have high needs, improving college and career readiness in high schools, a whole bunch of stuff. But it's been a ramp up, and it costs more and more each year, and it contributes to the long-term structural budget deficit, right? When you've got to pay all this more, and it's also a burden on counties. They're part of it too. One of the pieces that was about to come into play is called teacher collaborative time. And what this is giving teachers more time outside of the classroom so they can work with each other, they can work on their own, they can do preparation so they can do a better job when they're in front of their students. Problem is you need a lot of teachers, and you got to pay a lot of teachers to cover all the classroom time, and Maryland is in a teacher shortage. And the governor flagged this publicly as something he wanted to look at back in December. And people kind of agree it's hard to take on this policy if you don't have the teachers. So that was a key part of a plan he unveiled to save $1.6 billion over 4 years in the blueprint. He wanted to pause that program for 4 years, along with a bunch of other changes, some of which in his proposal would have hit per pupil funding for the poorest kids learning English, as well as for community schools, which have extra services in high poverty neighborhoods, as well as for a mental and behavioral health program. So he wanted to cut all these. That's why he came in. It was very unpopular, and there was a lot of negotiations through the session, and lawmakers really scaled back the cuts that Moore had proposed to the blueprint.
Yeah, Brenda, that takes me to you. You wrote a story kind of looking at the relationship between the governor and lawmakers and what was different in year 3. The blueprint seemed to be kind of a primary example of how things change. Can you talk about what you heard from lawmakers and what you see as those differences in the relationship?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as Pam said, I think the budget took the oxygen out of the session, but that was the headline. But the subtext was these relationships being tested between the governor and the legislature. But like Pam said, not so much between the House and Senate. I think they linked arms very early on because they knew they were going to have to stick together on this. But I think the difference that I heard from lawmakers is that this year, Governor Moore did not bring people along. He didn't have the meeting ahead of the meeting. And they told me they would have wanted to know what his changes to the budget and the blueprint were going to be well in advance of the session. But one of those key record scratch moments, I think, was when Governor Moore rolled out his budget in January, and there were massive hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts proposed to programs for intellectually and developmentally disabled adults programs. And that was just too far for many of the Democratic lawmakers. These are some of the core programs and the core ideologies of the Democratic Party here in Maryland. These are, as one political analyst described it to me, they're sacred cows. This is the social safety net, right, of Maryland. And they rejected that proposal of going that far. And I heard from people in the DDA community that Governor Moore and his team worked very closely to really understand those needs and restore those cuts and those measures. And I heard from Democratic leaders that they were very glad that that happened, and they wanted that to happen indeed. So I think that showed up again in the blueprint when, we saw the proposal that Pam just described so well hit the committee, and 24 of the state superintendents signed a letter in opposition to his plans. More than half of them showed up to testify against it in the middle of the work week. And if they didn't speak that day, some of them were in the audience in support. Teachers were against this, student groups were against this. It was a stunning rejection of one of Governor Moore's proposals. And I think that was this is perhaps a year where there's a moment to take stock for everyone involved, maybe realize that, not Democrats are not a monolith. They're not all going to agree on the same types of proposals. And I think that in earlier years, Governor Moore had a sweeping success. 10 out of 10 of his bills passed in his first year, even though some of the lawmakers watered some of them down. There just wasn't this like bubbling over of kind of conflict, I guess, behind the scenes and really publicly that we saw this year.
I mean, what did you notice about where he was more hands-on with the legislature and what they were doing, and where he was more hands-off about his approach?
So in terms of the budget and the blueprint, I think he was very out front on that, on both of those, in saying why they needed to be done, why they needed to be changed, why these things were necessary. He was also very vocal about his plans to grow the economy. And I think here is another place where the Democratic legislature and Governor Moore may have rubbed each other the wrong way. Moore is very economy focused right now, pro-growth focused. He often criticizes Governor Larry Hogan's administration for not working hard enough to grow the economy. And I think that some of his talking points about jumping into quantum and AI and cyber sound like a trickle-down economics approach, almost like a Republican talking point, building a broad tax base. And lawmakers told me that those turn them off, the Democrats. And they were kind of like a foreign concept, like, hey, is this guy one of us? They were wondering about some of those talking points. Now, Democratic lawmakers do believe in growing the economy. I believe they just have different ways that they would go about it. The Democrats perhaps want to strengthen the economy by allowing social programs to lift all the boats, whereas the Republican ideology more wants to broaden the tax base, make this a more business-friendly environment, and so on.
Pamela, what did you notice this year that was different in the governor's approach?
The governor, the first 2 years, was very warmly received when he would testify on his bills. And look, it was a change from Governor Larry Hogan, who made it a point not to go in person. He didn't feel that that was his role. That was not part of his strategy. So the Democrats and even Republicans appreciated hearing from the governor, but his ambitions were less and his challenges were less in the first 2 years. So I don't think he got the warmest reception when he testified on his budget balancing bill. It was in this like the biggest room they have in Annapolis. It was like all the budgeting committees in there. And he made his pitch. And Democrats asked not a single question of the governor on this very unpopular budget balancing plan with tax increases and cuts. And, Republicans had some questions, but Democrats did not. And that was maybe some signaling. Another time when the governor was in public on his agenda was for a bill called the Decade Act, which ultimately failed. It was like 140 pages of changing around economic development programs and incentives. And he had a challenging time making his case for this bill that was just lawmakers just couldn't get through it. And mostly they ask questions like, well, what about, such and such industry in my district? Are they still maybe eligible for this program or that program? And you just I didn't sense quite as much enthusiasm to give the governor what he needed and what he wanted. And he frankly had to spend most of his political capital and focus on the budget and on the blueprint bill.
All right, Maddie, I've got a question for you from a subscriber here. And just a reminder, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask, there's a little Q&A button down at the bottom. Click on that, type in your question. We see them. They don't appear to everybody else. But Maddie, this is one of the governor's proposals. What happened to beer and wine in grocery stores? Wasn't that a big revenue generator?
Yeah, Governor Moore kind of out of nowhere in December tweeted that he wanted to see beer and wine sales come to Maryland grocery stores. And Maryland hasn't had that in decades, if I'm remembering correctly. It's a popular, regular people want this because they want to be able to just pick up a bottle of wine on their way out of the grocery store. And so it is a very popular proposal among regular people, but among lawmakers, it was not popular at all. And it died pretty quickly in the legislative session. Neither the House nor the Senate versions of the bill made it out of their respective committees in time for crossover, which is the key deadline for bills to make it out of one chamber and into the other. And I think a lot of lawmakers were concerned about killing mom and pop liquor stores, which, is a loud constituency, certainly. And they have active lobbying groups that really went to bat for them and said, we really, really do not want this. We want to be able to keep mom and pop liquor stores open in Maryland. And, nobody wants to be responsible for small businesses shutting down. And so lawmakers kind of said, sorry, Governor, we don't want to do this. And he even on the first day of the session kind of acknowledged that it wasn't going to go well and said, this is not one of my legislative priorities this year. So he backed off pretty quickly, and lawmakers were happy to see that and did not give him much ground there.
And Pamela and Brenda, a question that actually we were kind of discussing this the other day in Annapolis, but this is from Todd. I'm interested in hearing more on your sense of why some of the efforts to close corporate tax loopholes failed. Governor Moore and the House seem to be finally moving forward on things like combined reporting, making out-of-state corporations have to report their income in the state rather than using accounting gimmicks to get around those taxes. But the Senate soured on it. Why do you think the Senate soured on combined reporting?
That's been sort of the position for a few years now. There are, groups that have been pushing to close what they see as corporate tax loopholes, including requiring combined reporting. The House, which is much more interested in raising revenue, has been on board with this for a while. The Senate has not. The governor's proposal kind of tried to thread the needle. He said in his proposal he wanted to require combined reporting for these big corporations. At the same time, he wanted to cut the corporate tax rate. So in the end, to the state of Maryland, it would have been kind of neutral, revenue neutral, but he kind of paired those together. And neither one of those came out in the end in the wash. I think this is a tricky one. It's like hard to understand how it works. Frankly, I struggle with it. And it's just been for years, this difference of opinion between the two chambers, whether this is the right way to go or whether it might, chase away businesses to other states. There's like a very real fear of that. I don't know if that's an actual threat or a perceived threat, but that's one of the factors.
A question that's kind of in a similar ballpark here on revenues and the tax policies that got chosen here. Why is our state government adverse to taxing the ultra wealthy, people who have a net worth of 50 million plus? $100 million corporations and $1 billion corporations. If they're not paying their fair share in taxes, those taxes are being shifted onto the middle class.
Well, I'd be interested to know what the estimate is of how many people we have who have $50 million of net worth or $50 million of income to tax more. But again, I think there's a concern about chasing people out of the state. Certainly, the more money you have, the more mobile you are, the more options you have. Look, people got worried when McCormick was making some noise earlier this session about if there at one point there was a proposed business to business tax and they were saying, oh, this will chase us away. I don't know if that's real or if it's just a negotiating point, but like Maddie said with the liquor stores, nobody wants to like be on the hook for having made small businesses close. Nobody wants to be blamed for corporations or wealthy taxpayers leaving the state.
All right, let's move on to kind of the third big topic that dominated this session, which is the Trump administration. Basically, Brenda, you've written about this several times in a couple of different ways, but what's been state leaders' reactions so far? Governor Moore, lawmakers, we have a new Maryland Freedom Caucus that's kind of been weighing in as well to what they've been seeing from the second Trump administration so far.
Well, if we remember way back to the beginning of the session, it was during the middle of a committee hearing where we heard the Secretary of Health tell lawmakers that the funds had been shut off from getting reimbursed for any of the Department of Health's programs. And that started things off with quite a shock. And then we kind of moved into just waiting for this uncertain period to pass where Congress had to decide what they were going to do with the continuing resolution. Reactions have been of a controlled panic, perhaps. I would describe it. It was never not there. It was, Senate President Bill Ferguson continually talked about the uncertainty that they were all dealing with and that clouded their every decision. I mean, he probably said that once or twice a week. And it showed up in all the decisions, including in the budget, where the Senate put in some triggers into the budget so that if certain things happened, that they could pull certain budget levers or access certain money, and Pam would know the details of that more than I would. I didn't cover the budget as intimately, but they were thinking about it in absolutely every way, and they are additionally concerned about the larger budget resolution, which threatens to cut billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicaid across the country, and what that would mean for their programs here that, like I said, they are proud of and hold dear, that our government here is one that aims to support people when they need that help. So in addition to that, we saw a lot of, I think, emboldened behavior from Republicans in the General Assembly. And that showed up in most prominently in the formation of the Maryland Freedom Caucus. Now, this is one of 13 across the country that are popping up in states, and they're modeled after the House Freedom Caucus, which are the leader of the House Freedom Caucus in Washington is Maryland Congressman Andy Harris. And he was intimately involved in helping them create this Maryland Freedom Caucus. So big picture here, Republicans in the General Assembly are about a third of the leadership here. And this group is 7 of that already small group. But for their small number, they sure make a lot of noise. And I believe this is part of their plan. So they came out very aggressively with on media. They were in front of every camera that they could get in front of. They would hold a press conference off to the side, and you'd see Republican House and Senate leaders having their own press availability separate from the Freedom Caucus, even though they were all Republicans. So on the very last day too, this is an interesting tidbit. There were some House leaders who had a press conference, and just around that time, it was time to convene the last session of the night in the House, and the House Freedom Caucus members came by, and the Democratic leaders were done, and they kind of hijacked the press conference and stepped in front of the cameras and answered a bunch of questions. And they are 100%, this small group is 100% backing all of Trump's plans very vocally, and trying to propose any type of amendment that they can to either weaken or just kind of make their political point on the floor and show what their position is so that they can amplify it.
There's a follow-up question here from a reader asking, was the Freedom Caucus effective in getting laws passed and/or watering down bills?
No, they are not effective. They are, like I said, a minority of a minority, and that's an important perspective here. For the amount, they made far more noise than the effectiveness of their legislation. And they also very often tie anything that they try to do in the General Assembly to a national issue so that they can plug into the momentum of what we're seeing at the federal level with the Republican Party.
And Maddie, you had noted to me during the session that the Freedom Caucus is, they're decent at getting attention from some of the national conservative right-wing groups out there, including like Libs of TikTok and some of the accounts like that, right?
Yeah, they've become very good at generating like right-wing press for themselves, and I'm including places like Libs of TikTok, which is a far-right news organization, is not even the right word for it. It's just like a troll account on Twitter, I mean, in some cases, the Democrats kind of handed them gifts because they were trying to pass laws that would, for example, decriminalize the sale of condoms in school vending machines, which, the Democrats just intended to say, like, hey, if you want to sell condoms to high schoolers and make sure that they, have a way to have safe sex, that's no longer illegal. It was not requiring condoms to be sold in elementary schools or anything like that. But the Freedom Caucus jumped on that, and they made a huge stink. They called it Condoms for Kiddies, and they tweeted about it nonstop, and it got picked up by Libs of TikTok. I think it got picked up by Fox National. So they clearly have a finger on the pulse of what will create outrage among right-wing media, and they know how to exploit it, and they've gotten pretty good at it. And by comparison, the Democrats in the Maryland State House were nowhere near that ability in terms of their social media fight. A lot of them have just given up on Twitter because it's become sort of this, they consider it kind of a right-wing cesspool since it was purchased by Elon Musk. And they just do not have the same firepower. In much the same way nationally that people have been noting that there's a much bigger right-wing media ecosystem online than there is a left-wing one. So the Democrats just did not have any way to fight back, and it was quite effectively managed by the Freedom Caucus this year.
Pamela, Brenda talked about some of the budget implications of what's coming from the Trump administration. You've written about how the broad Republican plan for spending and tax cuts could mean $1 billion in cuts to Maryland's Medicaid funds. How are lawmakers preparing for that possibility? One of the questions we got from a reader is there any chance of a special session later this year? I heard Brenda mention that we have this committee kind of tracking what's happening in DC. So how are folks preparing for that?
One of the biggest concerns among the many concerns coming from Washington is Medicaid specifically, and Brenda hinted at this. My colleague Meredith Cohn, who's an excellent health reporter here at the Banner, and I teamed up on a story about what Medicaid cuts from the federal government would mean to Maryland. Now, Medicaid is health insurance. It's a government program. It's for people with low incomes, disabilities. A lot of children are on Medicaid. A significant number of babies born in the state are covered by Medicaid. And if Republicans in Congress go through with their budget cutting plans to extend the Trump tax cuts, it could mean $1 billion to Maryland. Now, to put that in perspective, the entire state budget is $67 billion. The Medicaid budget is about $16 million, and $16 billion, $9 billion of it comes from the federal government. So if they lose $1 billion, that is very bad news for people on Medicaid, very bad news for the state health department, very bad news for the state budget. And that's just one thing that could be coming Maryland's way. So yes, there are triggers in the budget that if federal funding decreases by a certain amount, the governor will be required to talk to lawmakers about the problem. There's also that new committee set up by the General Assembly to monitor all things happening in Washington. It's Republicans, Democrats, House, Senate all together. And one more thing they're preparing is they have reestablished a state commission on healthcare access. They did this before when the Affordable Care Act was under attack. Now they're going to look at it again, specifically looking at this Medicaid issue, any changes to the Affordable Care Act, so they can prepare and make recommendations should lawmakers need to act. And hey, odds are looking pretty good right now that there may have to be a special session. Some people are saying maybe in the fall, depending on what comes from Washington. If any of these cuts come and hit the budget a lot, they may not be able to wait until January to change course and figure out how to close bigger gaps. We could be back in Annapolis later this year.
All right. Also on the Trump front here, Maddie, you've been tracking the lawsuits that the state, Baltimore City, and some of these other groups have been filing against the administration and their executive orders. Where do things stand with those lawsuits, and kind of what are the most significant decisions that we're waiting on right now?
Oh, there's a lot of lawsuits. And if you want to know every single one, you can check out the tracker that I put together for the banner. That is tracking all of the lawsuits against the Trump administration brought by the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore. And I mean, just to kind of set this up, this is not like a statement of opinion. This is just a fact. The Trump administration is doing a lot of unlawful things that are very plainly illegal, and they are just ignoring the law. And so all of these organizations, institutions, states, cities have been suing them left and right to get them to stop doing the unlawful things that they are doing. And in some cases, even when a court order has been issued, the Trump administration has not stopped doing those illegal things, which has created a lot of chaos, a lot of uncertainty. But in Maryland is, I think Moody's found that Maryland is the state among the 50 states that is the most at economic risk because of the Trump administration's cuts. And that's largely because Maryland is so dependent on federal workers for a big chunk of its economy. So as the Trump administration goes around, again, unlawfully firing a lot of workers, that has a huge impact on Maryland's economy. And so lawmakers early in the session said that they were going to find money for the Attorney General's office so that Attorney General Anthony Brown could put together a litigation team and sue the Trump administration whenever it's an instance where it might particularly hit Maryland. And what we're seeing is there's a lot of things that the Trump administration is doing that are going to particularly hit Maryland. Whether it's intentional or not, I'm not sure. But Anthony Brown has been suing a lot. I think there are at least 10 lawsuits against the Trump administration by the Attorney General's office. It's usually as part of a collaboration with other Democratic attorneys general from across the state. Sometimes there are some Republican states sprinkled in there. And so right now, I mean, the biggest thing that just happened was one of the biggest federal workers lawsuits over the firing of probationary federal employees was brought in Maryland. And a local judge in Baltimore said that the Trump administration had to reinstate those workers because he found that the administration did not follow the law when it did a mass firing of federal employees. It didn't follow the procedure that you're supposed to follow when you do a massive reduction in force. And so all those probationary workers got their jobs back, at least for a little while. But now that has been reversed on appeal by an appeals court. And so thousands of federal employees are kind of living in a state of chaos because the Trump administration says one thing, a judge says another thing and reverses it, but then here comes an appeals court and reverses that again. So this is kind of the problem with governing by lawsuit. There's a lot of shifting, moving parts and pieces, and it's very difficult to follow And so with the Trump administration moving at lightning speed, a lot of these lawsuits are simply struggling to keep up with the rate at which the administration is acting.
Maddie, one of the other subplots of this session you covered was how lawmakers wanted to respond to the federal immigration crackdown.
Mhm.
How did that debate go? Where did lawmakers ultimately end up on those bills? And why did they come down to kind of the last minute during the session?
Yeah, well, the nice answer to that is that lawmakers had a lot of things on their plate. It was a very difficult session, and so it came down to the wire on immigration. The slightly less nice answer to that is that this is a thorny political issue, and no one wanted to take responsibility for the fact that if they made aggressive moves on immigration, the Trump administration might retaliate by cutting federal funding to the state. So one example was lawmakers early in the session made a lot of noise about what they were going to do to protect immigrant communities against the Trump administration's crackdown. One proposal would have ended these agreements. They're called 287G agreements, and they are formal agreements between local law enforcement and ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that's doing a lot of the immigration crackdown. And local law enforcement can partner with ICE to help ICE identify people who have immigration detainers when they have been charged with crimes. And the legislature, some lawmakers wanted to end that because opponents of this program say that it deputizes local law enforcement to act as ICE agents and creates a sense of fear among immigrants that if they call the police for help when a crime is occurring, that they might get picked up even if they're not the one who did anything wrong. And so lawmakers at the beginning of the session were, gung-ho about trying to end this program. And as the session went on, it became clear that this was going to be a tough issue because lawmakers were afraid that if they did so, if they ended these programs, that the Trump administration would retaliate by cutting federal funding. And that was a theme throughout the session. Even without Trump having to say anything, lawmakers were worried that if they took aggressive actions against the federal government, that the government would hit back. And in the case of 287G agreements, it would be unlawful for the Trump administration to cut federal funding because Maryland ended them. These are voluntary agreements. But the Trump administration doesn't seem to care. And so lawmakers, whether they would admit to it or not, were afraid that they would be the ones left holding the bag if the Trump administration reacted poorly and retaliated by cutting money. So in the end, we ended with a whimper, not with a bang. They passed a compromise bill that really ended up doing very little. There is some protection in there for sensitive locations like churches sensitive locations in general are churches and courthouses and schools that ICE used to avoid doing enforcement actions at. Under the Trump administration, it is no longer avoiding those locations. And so lawmakers did pass a bill that would protect sensitive locations, but in the end, they passed a very watered down version that really only protects people at public sensitive locations like courthouses, like public schools. And more broadly, lawmakers really didn't do much of anything, much to the disappointment of immigration protection advocates.
I've got a follow-up question here from Amy that's about the immigration debate, but it's kind of more broadly about how the process in Annapolis works, which is why do they think it's okay to hijack a bill through the amendment process and totally change it? With the examples she's giving here of HB 1222 and SB 828, craziness at the very end regarding the 287G program. So the legislature used this crazy amendment switcheroo to almost get rid of the 287G program. So Maddie, you could take that one, or Pam. This is something we see kind of every year in one example or another, where they'll take one bill and then kind of raft another bill onto it, or completely rewrite that bill.
Yeah, in the case of the 287G agreements, there was a bill, House Bill 1222, that would have ended them. It was a compromise bill also. It would have required local correctional facilities to notify ICE before releasing people who have immigration detainers and who have been convicted of certain serious crimes. And it also would have ended 287G agreements, which, act more broadly. So it was seen as a compromise bill, but ending 287G agreements was seen as politically unfavorable at the moment. And so what ended up happening was on the last day of the legislative session, the Senate completely stripped down that bill for parts, ripped out everything about 287G, and placed a compromise and an even more watered down compromise bill in its place, and then passed 1222. And so in effect, they kind of ripped out everything that was valuable to immigration advocacy groups out of the bill and replaced it with much less helpful things, and then passed that bill, totally hijacking the bill and its intent, and ultimately passing something that was much, much less powerful and offered much less protection for immigrant communities. But still passing a bill that, on its face is called the Maryland Values Act, even though it is not the bill that as it was introduced.
And if I could add procedurally, the rules of the House and Senate, they have something called single subject rule, which is that a bill, you can't graft on like completely dissimilar ideas into a bill. Because this bill was about immigration and local, Maryland policy on federal immigration and how that intersects. All of these things were fair game to have in or out of the bill, the 287G, the sensitive spaces. That's actually allowed. Single subject rule is interpreted pretty broadly, although sometimes, there are rulings that a proposed amendment is out of order because it violates a single subject rule. And I think, Maddie, maybe we'll talk later on about one bill getting grafted onto another bill at the end, where people use the ability for the broad interpretation of single subject rule to get something done.
All right, we've got a couple questions on energy issues. Let me remind folks that if you want to ask a question, the little Q&A button at the bottom, you click on it, type in your question, we'll get it. Todd asks, what laws were passed to address BGE's abuse of the STRIDE Act and multi-year plans that I've read from the Office of People's Counsel the BGE uses to recoup and advance costs of gold-plated infrastructure projects on the backs of consumers? Did the Ratepayer Protection Act pass in any form? Another reader asks, update on anything this session that addressed BGE's outrageous bills this winter. So I we a little short-sighted here that we didn't have either of our two reporters who were covering energy issues on this call. Adam Willis, who's our environment reporter, and Bria Overs, who's a business reporter who's covered this from kind of the consumer standpoint. But we wrote a story about this not too long ago. And so here's the summary of what happened this year, which is there were a series of bills intended to address some of these issues. Advocates have celebrated some reforms to the STRIDE Act that were passed this year. They're calling it a huge win for ratepayers over utility companies. That the legislature, they didn't eliminate STRIDE completely, but they did tighten up the laws to restrict how utilities can take advantage of STRIDE or multi-year rate planning. Under the bill, utility companies like BG&E have to provide more information to justify gas pipeline projects to regulators and show their benefits to customers. They also have to prioritize projects based on safety risk and cost effectiveness and weigh investments against alternatives like leak detection, repair, or even retirement of portions of the gas system. The STRIDE reforms also clamp down on utility reliance on contractors rather than their own workforce. And investor-owned utilities will be banned from spending ratepayer money on private planes. There was an additional thing kind of that popped up late in the session, Pamela, right? That the state is going to tap a pool of money to try and give some rebates to customers this year.
That's right. Part of what's baked into this legislation, which very grateful to Adam Willis. He's done a great job covering this. One of the things tacked in there is tapping this fund. It's called SEEF, the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, I believe, and using money from there to give all of us BG&E customers, Pepco customers, a little bit of relief. On average, we're going to see $40 in the summer, $40 in the winter, give or take. If you've got a big electric bill, you're going to see more. If you're doing a good job with your energy efficiency and have a small home, you're going to see less. But that was like a nod to the very real challenge that, rising energy bills are hitting people hard and people are struggling. I don't know if $40 twice is going to make a big difference, but it's, one thing that lawmakers found they could do.
Okay, a question a couple people asked here. Andy, Sharonda both asked this question. Do you think Wes Moore is going to sign the Reparations Commission bill? So let's explain what the Reparations Commission bill is and what it would do, and then talk about whether or not this bill has been sent to the governor. Do you think he'll sign it?
Yeah, I'll start by saying, like, I don't make predictions on what any politician is ever going to do. So we'll see. He has until the end of May to decide. What this bill does is it creates a commission, 20 some people on it, from a variety of sectors who have expertise to look at whether and how the state government should engage in some sort of, reparations action for people who have suffered the ill effects of not only slavery but also state sanctioned discrimination. We're talking about, redlining, university, admissions back in the day, and all of the sort of structural racism that we have had in our state. This is only a study, and they will look at things of, yes, you think reparations and you think, money paid to people, but they're also going to look at, should there be apologies made on behalf of the state of Maryland that sanctioned this? Should there be, tax credits, like job assistance, like policy changes? They have a very broad charge of what they can look at. And again, this is a study only. Look, if the governor signs the bill and this commission gets to work, it will be fascinating to watch. And maybe 1, 2, 3, 4 years down the line, they will come back with proposals and to debate what those actions should be. But this is not like sending a blank check to a whole bunch of people in Maryland. This is starting a conversation and starting to research this issue.
Is this a bill that the governor even has to sign? Can it become law without a signature?
No, if he doesn't sign it and doesn't veto it, just like any bill, it's a regular bill. He can sign it, goes into law. He can veto it, which it would very likely be overridden, or he could not put his signature on it, which is sort of a passive aggressive tool that governors have to allow something to become law without endorsing it. So, I have some guesses of what the governor would do, but I'm not in the predicting business.
All right, here's a question I'll ask to the group is, who do you see as stars of the session among the legislators? Did anybody catch your eye this year, guys?
Well, okay, I'll start. I spent all my time talking with the budget chairs. So now the people who are chairs of the committees already, are in leadership, and each year there's sort of different ones are in the spotlight. So it was Senator Guy Gazzoni in the Senate, and Delegate Ben Barnes and Delegate Vanessa Atterbury in the House on the 2 budgeting and taxing committees. Look, they all have very sharp command of the issues. All 3 of them are very good at explaining what's going on with the budget. And Chair Atterbury also had the education bill in her committee and was very engaged on that, very clear about where she stood and explaining things. And, I saw a couple, I'll give a shout out to Delegate Stephanie Smith from Baltimore City, had a really great mic drop argument in favor of the Reparations Commission. Delegate Malcolm Ruff had some really great compelling words in support of the state budget. So those were a couple moments of people who stood out to me.
Brenda or Maddie, anybody jump to mind?
I do. I have some thoughts on this. So I would say, I more closely than my previous 2 sessions, I was watching Delegate Jazz Lewis a lot, and I was really interested in him. He serves as the House Majority Whip. So he's responsible for figuring out where his members stand on certain bills before they come to a vote. And I thought he had a really measured way of just presenting ideas to protect federal workers, to kind of be out in front of that, to be out in front on labor issues. And I also thought equally that Delegate Mark Fisher was a prominent figure in this legislative session. He was very vocal. He spoke out. He was very blunt on the floor. He gave some stunning remarks, memorable remarks about some of the bills, including on reparations that were in opposition to it, that I think really riled up the Democrats, and it's exactly what he aimed to do. So I think he accomplished his mission. So for that, I would say he was a very notable character.
I think I'm only going to add one person, and it was kind of, and almost unfortunately, it was kind of a big session for Delegate C.T. Wilson. He number one, he was leading a lot of the discussion on energy legislation, which was huge this year. There was a lot of attention to it. He was sort of a big voice on advocating for some of the energy bills that ultimately ended up passing. He also this year had to come back and advocate for changes to one of the key pieces of legislation that he has ever fought to pass, the Child Victims Act. He spent nearly a decade advocating for the passage of the Child Victims Act, which lifted the statute of limitations on out-of-date childhood sexual abuse claims so that people who were abused as children can now sue as adults. And that was really painful for him because he spoke repeatedly about his own experience with childhood sexual abuse and his experience as an adult survivor. So that passed in 2023, and then it became clear with all the lawsuits coming out that the state of Maryland was facing literally thousands of claims from people who were sexually abused in juvenile detention centers, and that the state of Maryland could be on the hook for multiple billions of dollars in lawsuit settlements because of this. And it was a difficult budget year. Lawmakers did not like to hear that. They got skittish. And so they started pushing on Delegate Wilson to propose some fixes to the Child Victims Act. And ultimately what they passed and what Delegate Wilson supported, even though you could tell it was very difficult for him, they ended up slashing by more than half the amount of money that childhood sexual abuse survivors can win if they sue either against the state or against private institutions like the church. And that only applies going forward as of June 1st and moving forward, those lowered caps will apply. But that means that anyone who has not brought their lawsuit already now has to hurry up and get a lawyer and get to court, because if they don't sue June 1st, they will be sub-law. So that was a really tough session for Delegate C.T. Wilson.
All right, another good question from Todd. What happened to the Arts Stabilization Act? Did Moore's attempts to revoke the 1994 stabilizing formula succeed, or did arts advocates succeed in keeping it? Pamela?
Short answer, arts advocates succeeded. I just looked it up today. This is a formula on how much arts funding is given by the state to arts organizations. Governor Moore proposed getting rid of this formula to make it more discretionary, but it didn't make it in the end.
All right, another question here. This is kind of your ballpark, Pam. What is your take on how the state's takeover of the horse racing industry and keeping the Preakness in Baltimore is going? It seems the stadium authority is a good thing at first glance, but the industry is crazy. In most areas of the country, it seems like horse racing exists because of public subsidies. Would we even be having this discussion if not for the Preakness?
I think that is an apt analysis of the horse racing industry, which I cannot get away from covering as hard as I might try. Yeah, I mean, Maryland racing exists with the help of a lot of subsidies from, gambling, lottery, other places, and it's because of the Preakness and the Preakness meet. If not for that, I don't know that there would be this much level of really state support. Taxpayer financed bonds are going to pay for a redo of Pimlico that is going to start after Preakness this year. The Preakness is going to move to Laurel for, they believe, 1 year. We'll see if this stays on track. And the state now owns Pimlico Racecourse. Like, that is a state asset now, just like the football stadiums. Look, there's a lot of reluctance in Annapolis. Lawmakers are never thrilled when they have to deal with horse racing bills. They don't share the same enthusiasm for the industry that maybe folks in the industry or who grew up with it do. So we'll see. The state just abolished a state authority that was overseeing the transition of the industry. The Maryland Stadium Authority will have responsibility for running the project at the track to renovate it. They were already involved before, so the Stadium Authority tells me it's going to stay on schedule. We'll see where it goes from here.
All right, question here from Michael, which is, how serious is Maryland about getting into the data center race? The demand is there, it would seem, but there are a lot of trade-offs. This is something we've heard Governor Moore talk about a lot previously. And then with a lot of different energy debates this year, I've heard less from him about it. But where does that stand?
Yeah, there was legislation last year about data centers and the emergency generators they need for backup and the approval process for those. And it was like very angsty. It is an emerging industry. There is some fear that Virginia might get all these data centers, and the power line that everybody hates that's proposed, would that fuel Virginia data centers and not Maryland? Is this the way that Maryland wants to go? A bunch of to build the industry? The governor talks about diversifying the economy. I'm not sure exactly where that would fit into it.
All right, we got time for one last question. I want to ask the three of you. What was your favorite moment of the session? I'll start with, I thought the blueprint bill hearing, the joint hearing between the House and the Senate was fascinating. The governor sent his staff in to testify and did not testify himself. And it was they faced a very kind of hostile legislature about what the governor was proposing. But what moments stood out for you guys?
I'll start with actually a serious also moment. I don't know, I think just a week ago, but it could have been 3 years ago, but it was the International Day of Transgender Visibility. This is a celebration that the governor brought for the first time to the State House 2 years ago. 2 years ago, it was very celebratory, very joyous event. This year, not so much. And a person named Lee Blinder, who is chair of the state's LGBTQ plus commission, and they're also the founding executive director of Trans Maryland, was given a citation, and then they got up to speak and really very calmly derided Governor Moore and criticized Governor Moore for not supporting the trans community enough. That while he has been supportive in the past, wasn't backing any legislation that they saw, wasn't putting enough money in the budget, and the spine it takes to stand up right next to the governor of the state of Maryland and just very calmly say what problems you have with them was absolutely remarkable. It is something I have not seen before. And the governor took it. The governor looked right at them and heard the words, gave them a hug, and he really absorbed it. He handled it well, and we'll see where the relations go from there. But that was a remarkable moment for me.
Brenda?
Yeah, well, besides getting to work with these two incredible reporters and you as an amazing editor, I have a more serious note too, which maybe is fitting for this session, right? It was a very, very serious, and they covered a lot of big issues, but this notable moment for me was when we all heard the really horrible news that House Speaker Adrienne Jones had lost her son. And it was just a very somber day. I think, another component of that was just the reverence and respect her members had for her in that moment, and how the leaders all, of course, paid their due condolences. But it was early in the session still, when they have a lot of pro forma sessions on Fridays, and that happened to be the day of her son's funeral. And I don't know if all the members actually went, but they did not hold session that day so that many of them could come, or they had very small attending pro forma sessions so that people could go and pay their respects to her. And then the warm reception she received when she came back, and how she just carried on. She just soldiered on through the whole session. Pretty impressive.
Maddie?
I'll end with a fun one. Although I agree, this was a grim session in a lot of ways, and lawmakers had to make a lot of very unpleasant decisions. But one of the more pleasant decisions they got to make was right at the end of the session. So you might recall that last year, the state of Delaware claimed the Orange Crush as their state cocktail, even though it was invented in Ocean City, Maryland. And so, the lawmakers in Maryland were rightfully shocked and appalled by this. And so they took action, and they introduced legislation to name the Orange Crush the state cocktail of Maryland, because this is where it was invented. And it actually, on the last day of the session, it looked like this bill was going to fail. I wrote a blog post saying the bill was going to fail because it had not made it out of either committee. It was introduced by Republicans, and I think there was some little tension there. And so maybe the Democrats didn't want to do them a favor, even on a fun bill. But ultimately, what ended up happening was right at the last minute, under the wire, the Orange Crush legislation was added to a bill that named chromite as Maryland's state mineral. Please don't ask me about chromite. But It was slipped in at the last minute as an addition to the House bill, and the Senate passed the Orange Crush as Maryland's state cocktail as the very last bill of the night on Sine Die at 11:58 p.m., right before they closed down for the end of the session. So that was one of very few fun moments in this session.
Well, that is going to wrap up this webinar. We appreciate all of you for tuning in. We appreciate you for being a subscriber to the Baltimore Banner. Thank you so much. Your support is what keeps our journalism going. We're going to do these again in the future. And thanks so much for tuning in and asking your questions today.